Trifles by Susan Glaspell. Susan Glaspell was an American novelist, playwright, journalist, and actress. She was awarded Pulitzer Prize for her play Allison's House in 1931. Trifles is a one-act play based on an actual murder case that Glaspell reported for Des Moines Daily News. Trifles by Susan Glaspell. Summary. Trifles is a one-act play based on an actual crime. A wife murders her husband, tying a rope around his neck. Officers come to search the house to detect the person who committed the crime. They suspect the wife but cannot find any evidence against her. The scene is a farmhouse of Mr. Wright, a farmer. The sheriff and the county attorney come to the house, followed by a neighboring farmer, Mr. Hale, and his wife and the wife of the sheriff. Mrs. Wright was taken to the sheriff's house the previous day. The officers have come to investigate. Mr. Hale gives them an account of his visit to the house and the discovery of the murder. He wanted to meet Mr. Wright to talk about the party telephone. Mrs. Wright opened the door. She was sitting on the rocking chair holding her apron in her hand. She was not much inclined to talk. He said that he wanted to see her husband. She replied that he was dead and was lying upstairs. Somebody had put a rope around his neck and strangled him. She was sleeping on the same bed but did not know how or when it happened. Hale then left the place to report the matter to the sheriff. It was on his report that the sheriff made arrangement to take Mrs. Wright to his own house. Now the officers began to search the house. The attorney gets on a chair and looks into a cupboard closet. He finds that everything is in a mess. Mrs. Peters, the sheriff's wife, tells him that Mrs. Wright was much worried about her fruit. The sheriff answers that women are used to worrying over trifles. The attorney asks Mrs. Hale whether she was on good terms with Mrs. Wright and whether she frequently visited her. Mrs. Hale had no regular contact with her, though they were neighbors. She did not like the place. Moreover, nobody liked to have any contact with Mr. Wright. The sheriff asked his wife to take some clothes and other little things for Mrs. Wright. Then the officers go upstairs to see the dead body. The women start to do their own share of the investigation. They find some of the fruit in good condition. They take out a dress and shawl for her. There was no need for apron in jail, where she was most likely to go. They also suspect whether Mrs. Wright had done the crime. Mr. Henderson also thought the same. He only wanted to find a cause for the crime. There was no sign of anger. The only cure thing was the untidy condition of the kitchen. Mrs. Peters takes a large sewing basket with piece of quilt. Mrs. Wright had been stitching a quilt. Mrs. Hale looks at it and wonders whether she was going to quilt it or just knot it. The men enter hearing these words and the sheriff repeats them. They wonder if she was going to quilt it or just knot it. He simply meant to laugh at the woman for taking interest in trifles while they are doing serious investigation. The men go out to the barn. The women are now serious in their investigation. Mrs. Hale sees that the sewing work on the quilt went well for some time, then it became bad. That meant Mrs. Wright was off her mind. Now, Mrs. Peters searches for some paper to wrap up the skirt and shawl. She sees a bird cage in the cupboard, but there is no bird in it. Mrs. Hale remembers that a man came selling canaries last year. Mrs. Wright might have bought one as she loved songs. The cat might have killed the bird. Mrs. Peters does not believe that there was a cat in the house because during the previous night, Mrs. Wright was frightened when she saw the cat in the sheriff's house. They look at the cage closely and sees that its door is broken. Someone might have been rough with it. For some time they talk about the loneliness of Mrs. Wright. Her husband was a rough type. They had no children. Mrs. Hale feels sorry that she did not take her into friendship. They think that they must take the quilt also to Mrs. Wright. She would like it. Under the quilt, They see a red box. There was something wrapped up in silk inside the box. They opened it and saw the dead bird in it. Its neck was wrung. They put it back in the box before the men came down and hid it with the quilt. The men come down for a short while and then go up again. The women discuss the matters more seriously. Miss Hale thinks that Mr. Wright had killed the bird, and Mrs. Wright, in her resentment, killed him by putting a rope round his neck. But the men would laugh at them for taking such a silly thing as evidence. The women are full of sympathy for Mrs. Wright and wants to save her. Before the men return after finishing their work, Mrs. Hale puts the box with the dead bird in her big pocket. The attorney makes a final comment that she was not going to quilt it and asks the woman what else she was going to do. Mrs. Hale answers that she was going to knot it.